Hello, everyone, and welcome to the event organized by the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab and the Free Russia Foundation. We will be discussing the Foundation's new report on adapting and evolving Russian foreign interference, and it is an exciting report, and I hope many will read it. Especially here in Europe, it sometimes feels that the policymakers are preparing us for another round of US elections in 2016, although the situation has obviously changed already quite significantly. I am Jakub Kalensky. I'm a senior fellow at the Digital Forensic Research Lab, and I have the pleasure to introduce you to our speakers. First of all, the main author of the report, Dr. Maria Snegovaya, Atlantic Council's Eurasia team non-resident fellow and PP postdoctoral fellow at Virginia Tech's Kellogg Center. Hi, Maria.
Hello, Jakub. Thanks for having me.
We have Jessica Brandt, Head of Research and Policy at the Alliance for Securing Democracy in the German Marshall Fund.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
We have Dr. Marek Posart. Marek is a military sociologist at the RAND Corporation and, sorry, now I lost it, and a professor of policy analysis at the Pardee RAND Graduate School. Hi, Marek.
Hello, good morning.
And finally, and most importantly for me, our own Chief of Staff from Digital Forensic Research Lab, Nick Yap.
Thanks, Jakub.
So how we run the event, Maria will now walk us through the report. She will have around 5 minutes for that. Then we will have a few minutes of a moderated discussion. And in the last 20 minutes, we will be taking the questions from the audience. We encourage you to send your questions via the Q&A function, or we will also try to monitor the chat as well. So time is pressing us. Maria, if you could begin, what have you found out?
Yes, thank you very much, everyone, for hosting us and allowing us this opportunity. It's certainly a big honor to be presenting such an esteemed audience, and I'm expecting a very engaging conversation. So this report is completed in co-authorship with Kohir Botanovi, who is a associate professor from the University of Innsbruck and specifically focuses on quantitative analysis of information. Our goal was to bring together the quantitative studies and the policy analysis of these issues in an effort to address some of the questions that essentially are best addressed at the intersections of those two groups of skills. And our three takeaways is, first of all, despite a very successful counter effort since 2016, the Kremlin's social media influence in the United States has continued until 2020 and evolved. I'm going to focus on how it changed in a couple of minutes. Second of all, increasingly polarized domestic environment in the United States provides the Kremlin actors with more and more opportunities to continue essentially try and continue its effort in the United States. And three, through our own analysis, we also find the evidence of success of this effort, in the sense that there is some, even from our analysis, some successful impact on polarization among the US audiences. And now I'm going to go in a little bit more detail about what we found. First of all, the effort at banning and blocking suspicious accounts by the US intelligence community, which was ongoing over the last several years, certainly proves successful. It has significantly decreased the amount of popular accounts with multiple followers, and it forced the Kremlin actors to try and conceal their identity better. As a result, what we see in 2020 is, first of all, it's the pro-Kremlin actors have tried to conceal their identity to avoid being blocked or banned better. So this is seen as from the perspective of platforms that the Kremlin actors use, so it is from the perspective of the types of promoters that they employ. First of all, in terms of platforms, there is much more effort to polarize online discussions by drawing on existing narratives within the US domestic social media rather than creating new ones. Second of all, there is growing identity hijacking. Kremlin proxies have become more likely to take over authentic hashtags and mimic or appropriate names and logos of official campaigns and local groups in the United States. Three, the Kremlin actors have been moving increasingly to smaller platforms, mostly because they're successfully prosecuted on bigger platforms like Twitter or Facebook. Now they're found on smaller platforms, right? Reddit, 4chan, and blogs. And one of our key takeaways is that we actually need to devote more effort to studying Kremlin's activities on those, Kremlin actors' activities on those platforms rather than just Twitter. There's also an effort to increase narratives laundering in order to, again, which is suggestive of the intelligence operators whose mission is to carry out the work undetected, and more efforts to polarize online discussion by essentially hiring also sometimes local American citizens who are not aware of the actual reasons why they're being hired to promote the narratives that are beneficial for the Kremlin. When it comes to the promoters, we also notice several changes. First of all, there is declining number of bots, trolls, and fake accounts that are associated to the Kremlin, and declining number of their followers. And we attribute that directly to successful counter effort by the US intelligence community. But at the same time, we also find that trolls and bots are adjusting their behavior. They try to become more authentically American. And to do that, for example, they're trying to improve the English language, which used to be the one way to identify them fairly easily. That now, for example, instead of creating their own content, they would copy some chunks of the text produced by native English speakers in order to be pretend more authentic. And ultimately, bots have also evolved, trying to adopt more believable online profiles, more sophisticated conversational skills, and stronger resemblance to real humans. Now, when it comes to effectiveness of this effort, however, there is still no clarity in the existing analysis, be it academic or policy work. There is recent studies by Mark Bossard, among others, and Rand here at the panel. We're very honored to have him, who shows that actually there is some success in for deepening polarization for the narratives that are commonly used by Kremlin proxies. At the same time, we have some evidence that, for example, the content of the leaks, the DNC leaks in 2016, may have impacted the voting behavior in the US. Yet, there's also a number of studies in the US, for example, the longitudinal analysis of data on Republicans and Democrats, that shows that there's actually not significant impact by the IRA of the IRA accounts on the voting behaviors of the US citizens. So in order to contribute to this discussion, me, together with Professor Watanabe, also have done our own analysis. Between late October and early November 2020, at the time of the US election, we actually surveyed about 2,000 US-based Twitter users, thanks to the Lucid platform. We measured the attitudes and the number of voting preferences of these users, and at the same time also measured the engagement with so-called Russia-aligned content. Unfortunately, in our analysis, there's no way to say specifically to what extent the Russia-aligned content is deliberately pushed by Kremlin proxies. But we made an effort to identify the accounts that were, to the largest extent, essentially similar. They were pushing the content that's very, very similar to the content that is pushed usually by Kremlin proxies. And we measured how frequently our 2,000 respondents interacted with the content that's similar to what the Kremlin proxies usually push. So what did we discover? Several key takeaways. First of all, we find that, along with other studies, the engagement with Russia-aligned content is similar for US respondents on both sides of the political spectrum. It's not just far right, it's also far left. And this is consistent with other studies that have found that actually the Kremlin proxies try to collaborate with both extreme sides of the US political spectrum. Second of all, the high engagement aligned content actually correlated with increased individual propensity to take part in the US 2020 election. There is also Evidence that respondents who more actively interact with this content tend to share lower trust in mainstream media, specifically in the United States, and also lower trust in the US institutions. And ultimately, we find, in terms of the impact, that there is not just a higher propensity to take up part in the election, but also decreased individual propensity to support the presidential candidate from the opposite political camp of the respondents who are more actively engaged with Russia-aligned content, and would take that as an indication that the Kremlin proxies are fairly successful in deepening polarization. So if you are a far right, for example, have far right preferences, if you have more radical preferences on the far right, and for example, you are more likely to engage with Russia-aligned content, that makes you less likely to vote for Biden, and the other way around as well. So this suggests to some extent the evidence of polarization that is successfully pushed by the content that's similar to what the Kremlin proxies push. And the last part of our research and our analysis actually makes some policy recommendations. We find that the current effort that was done by the US intelligence community is actually quite successful, especially banning, blocking, and labeling of websites as being affiliated with Russia. We also recommend, of course, focusing on US domestic issues, such as trying to engage more actively with more radical groups and groups that are more likely to engage with disinformation-like content. And ultimately, of course, that's easier said than done. We recommend to try and restore the trust in traditional media, which we see to be a high predictor to engage with Russia-aligned content, by, for example, increasing more funding into platforms like PBS and NPR that hopefully will provide some kind of common ground for both sides of the political spectrum in the United States. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maria. It's a fascinating report. I have to admit that I got reminded a bit about the old KGB operations when you were talking about how the Russians are using the already existing fissures and tensions in the society. Our own Czechoslovak defector Ladislav Bittman used to talk about a mechanism of an evil doctor who tries to make a precise diagnosis of the patient, and then he's trying to make his illnesses worse, not to cure them, but to aggravate them. Jessica, let me turn to you. I know you would like to talk about the evolution of the information operations, Russian information operations in general. So what have you found out, and do you see any nightmare scenarios that we are not really prepared for?
Yeah, sure. Happy to cover this ground. Maria covered a lot of it, which is great. Yeah, I think broadly what we're seeing is a shift towards more targeted, harder to detect information operations that cover a broader swath of the information ecosphere. And I think there's maybe two factors that are driving that. The first is platform detection mechanisms have gotten better, and that's a good thing. But also Russia doesn't need large quantities of troll farm content to upend US domestic politics with corrosive, divisive narratives. We are, the fire is raging, and we're doing it to ourselves. The fire is raging, and they just need to as my colleague Laura Rosenberger has said, toss a little accelerant on the fire to direct it one way or another. That's the less good thing. I guess I have taken note of maybe four shifts in the Russian approach. The first Maria alluded to, which is the increasing co-option of authentic domestic voices and institutions. Doing things like co-locating trolls within a target country. We saw this in multiple countries in Africa ahead of elections there. Renting the authentic, social media accounts of local users. We saw that in Ukraine ahead of the 2019 presidential election. These are tools and tactics that are quite useful because it's very hard to, they are, I think, quite skilled at evading detection mechanisms. But in a maybe more meta sense, the involvement of and the co-option of authentic domestic voices really complicates remedies both for platforms and for government, because when you have citizens engaged in this activity, it immediately, as it should, trigger protections around, constitutional protections around expression. And that I would argue is first and foremost, but this is especially challenging because Russia's quite skilled at identifying sort of fellow travelers, folks whose political views might already be aligned. Maybe the second is like the perception hacking approach, so exploiting the anticipation that manipulation might happen to claim that it has, whether or not it has. So we saw this in 2018 ahead of the midterms when there was this claim of this vast and successful second troll farm operation that had hacked the election. No such like operation existed, but nevertheless, there was that attempt. I would say like researchers and journalists got wise, and it shows that like the techniques are evolving, but so are defense mechanisms. That's a good news story. But I would say also in this bucket is like what we saw around the Iowa caucuses just about a year ago, right? February last year, where the Buggy app, caused a bunch of mishaps, and Russia was quite skilled at like hopping on those narratives to claim that the corporate media and there was purported nefarious ties between candidates and apps, and it was all rigged. Again, like exploiting our fear of that manipulation might happen to claim it. Maybe I'll just tick through the other two very quickly, which is practicing tailored influence. So not like aiming to get large numbers of clicks, but to really to get the eyes of the right folks, and which includes journalists, to move information out into the broader information ecosystem, which I think is maybe my fourth point. And Nick has done a lot of interesting work on this, so maybe he'll pick up the thread from there. I guess just flowing from this, two nightmare scenarios that are like on my mind, and I'm curious for the other folks on the panel, what's on theirs, but the first I think is this use of authentic domestic voices, because of the way that I just think platforms are not prepared for dealing with this challenge, and there are really very good answers. So my colleague Brett Schaefer likes to say, like, if there were to be a hack and leak again, like why would Russia go to the effort of creating false personas that could easily be detected? I mean, you could just give information to potentially like true and newsworthy information to an authentic, to a fringe platform, or even maybe not so fringe, but folks that kind of again are in the fellow traveler category. That's a nightmare scenario. And I guess the second is this hack and leak broadly. If we saw this play out in 2020 with the New York Post story, and I mean this in a narrow sense, but Twitter very quickly said, this hacked materials, and took it down, stopped the spread of the information. But I guess the fundamental challenge is that in a hack and leak scenario, it's necessary, like quick action is necessary, but we almost certainly will not have definitive attribution in the moment. And so that puts like platforms again in a very difficult position. And I'm not sure, like Twitter had to walk back that policy. I mean, all the platforms kind of got caught flat-footed, and yet it was like a very predictable challenge. And I think there's just a real fundamental tension that hasn't yet been resolved. So I think hanging a little bit too much on a hack is on the hack and leak policy versus a broader set of policies is maybe not the right way to go. But we could talk about that more in Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you very much. It is something that we also see here in Europe very often. Russia co-opting the domestic voices. People like Marine Le Pen in France, Miloš Zeman here in Czech Republic, Viktor Orbán in Hungary. These people just want to attack the Western institutions, and they are waiting for every possible line to take, and Russia is happily providing them with some. But Marek, you have already been called out by Maria in her introductory remarks. You had a role in this report as well, and so perhaps you might want to walk us through how the U.S. environment in particular might be a fertile ground for this kind of operations.
Maria is very kind, and this is an excellent report, and I just want to plug it one more time because I got a chance to read it a second time, and it's an excellent report, Maria. I would just say that this is not America's first rodeo with these kinds of problems. George Washington warned about about foreign interference in our politics in his initial speeches as president. We had concerns about European powers interfering in our affairs during the Civil War. The British were trying to interfere to get us to get involved in World War II earlier, and we get involved with our presidential election. And of course, we all know Soviet active measures were quite active during the Cold War. we have this kind of discussion right now domestically about inequality. We have a lot of social problems in the US that no foreign adversary created. And it's something that I think we've continued to try to grapple with as we try to form a more perfect union. Things like economic inequality, racial inequalities, gender inequality, LGBTQ rights, you name it. And I think one thing that we have to remember is that these types of social problems are national security vulnerabilities. And our adversaries are taking notice and they're trying to find ways to gin us up. And I think that particularly right now, I think we're in a very awkward time because I think the pandemic has brought to the forefront a lot of different social problems that have been there for a while. They've just gone unnoticed. In some cases, it's been a victim of a benign neglect. And in some cases, I would argue we might actually be in a political realignment right now for what it means to be a Republican Democrat is changing. And these are opportunities for our adversaries, Russia, China, Iran, and others, to use information operations to, at a minimum, basically muck up our capacity to have a dialogue to build consensus on issues of public concern. If you think of America like a family, like any family, we have a lot of problems and issues and disagreements that we're all trying to work through, but we don't need Russia showing up to Thanksgiving dinner trying to pick fights between our family members. And that's exactly what's going on. And so there's the issue of the operations that are being run, but there's also this issue of why these opportunities exist in the first place. And I think one thing that we need to consider is that the domestic inequality that exists in our country are tactical opportunities for our adversaries to exploit. And the transaction costs for these kinds of things are quite low. It's very easy to run these operations. You do not need an infantry division. You do not need to spend decades investing in a major weapons system. All you need to do is have cheaply paid trolls and fake accounts, and you can set it up for a few months and you can have pretty decent impact. And if the Russians can do it, we have to remember that other countries are going to start doing this too. So I think we're in the starting phase of this, not the end phase of this. And I just want to note that the sources of this are very deep seated, and I think there's a larger issue here with how our domestic issues can actually become national security issues.
Thank you very much, Marek. And let me turn over to our Nick Yap. Nick, could you also walk us through the DFR Lab's work on the US elections? Have we also identified some shifts and changes and developments? What is your take on this?
Sure, I'm glad that we had the chance to have your cat make a feature on our panel. A lot of the findings of the DFR Lab in our work monitoring the US elections have already been kind of highlighted by these other panelists. The evolution of the operations to prioritize OPSEC, to prioritize an ability to remain undetected. We've seen all these shifts. One of the main things we focused on, though, was a more meta approach to the conversation around attribution claims as opposed to the attribution of the operations themselves. So a team here at the DFR Lab created what we call the Foreign Interference Attribution Tracker, FIAT. You can find it at interference2020.org. And what we did is we tracked all novel claims of interference in the US elections, and we created a rating system based on credibility, objectivity, evidence, and transparency of these claims, and basically ranked an attribution score to them to gauge things like the confidence of the assessment, how reliable it was. And then we tracked the media reach of these claims. So how much conversation did any given claim achieve in the US information environment? And what we saw, there were a number of trends that evolved, but one of the more unfortunate ones is that there wasn't necessarily a connection between higher attribution levels, attribution scores, and the reach of the claims and conversation about the claims themselves. So frequently, we would see a highly politicized claim getting incredible reach in the US environment, even if it wasn't necessarily supported by higher levels of attribution and evidence. And this builds to a trend that we've seen of this overall conversation, this overall topic of disinformation and foreign interference becoming a political weapon in and of itself. political actors have realized that there's advantage to making claims of interference to either create whataboutism or to create red herrings and change the conversation. And the higher level attributions that we saw necessarily didn't get that same level of claim, that same level of conversation. So this raises a lot of important points for us in civil society at large, in the public and media, on how to responsibly cover this topic, of how not to fall into things like Jessica was saying of the anticipation and playing into the hands. One of the biggest examples of this probably is peace data, which is one of the most concrete examples of Russian interference in 2020, a direct evolution of the IRA activity in 2016, an example of the sophistication, the growth. They co-opted US journalists. US journalists were paid to write, were paid by the Russians to write articles relating to US politics. And this is all pretty extraordinary, but at the same time, the reach was negligible compared to what we saw in 2016. And yet the coverage of it was extraordinary. It's one of the largest news stories in the US about Russian disinformation. So it raises a very kind of fundamental ethical question of the need to continue to uncover, to report on this, but at what point does that need to be right-sized with a conversation on impact and actual the actual result of that supposed interference or known interference in the elections. So it's a tricky line, and it also builds on the existing domestic divides that a lot of other speakers have already touched on.
That would actually be my question for all of you. You all have actually talked about how these information operations exploit the fissures or cracks in the societies. And our primary instinct would probably be to try and repair these weaknesses. But on the other hand, we do want to maintain some of these disagreements because we want to have free discussion, right? If we have a look how Russia is trying to protect their own information space by suppressing dissent voices, shutting down newsrooms, or murdering journalists, we certainly do not want to go that way. We want to protect the democratic exchange of opinions. So shouldn't we actually cope with the fact that we will have some weaknesses, which means that we will be exposed to aggression, and we have to do something about the aggressors rather than about our own weaknesses?
I mean, I think that's a great question. Just 2 points here. First, we have some research at RAND that's coming out in the next few weeks that no matter if you're Republican or Democrat, you voted for Donald J. Trump or Joe Biden, if you are pro or anti-gun control, abortion, 2 things that we found were, one, people routinely mistaken Russian content, the attribution of Russian content. When we showed them Russian content, they mistakenly almost always assume that it's fellow Americans producing it. And so one of the things that we've come to the conclusion is attribution is really important when this stuff is out there. And it turns out no matter what your views are, nobody wants Russia telling you what you should believe in or trying to amplify what you already believe, regardless of the issue. And I do think there, just note that the late Lawrence Eagleburger, I think, made a really good point about this when he discussed Soviet active measures in the 1980s. And it was the point that sunshine is the best disinfectant. You don't want to ignore these problems, but you also don't want to obsess over them. And I think that balance is going to be really key, and making sure that people know what content that they are consuming or being pushed out there that might affirm their beliefs may not necessarily be from their fellow Americans. And so that can then in turn lead to people making gross generalizations about various groups of people, urban versus rural, Democrat, Republican, that are just completely mistaken based on their reactions to content that they thought were from other American activists, but in reality, they're not actually. They're from, someone associated with a foreign intelligence service.
Can I just make the case for an all of the above approach? I might put a larger frame on this, which is that democracies are engaged in a persistent asymmetric competition with authoritarians, and information operations or information manipulation is one of many tools that these regimes use to shore up power at home, and to interfere in democracies is a way of, I would argue, like distracting and dividing them, keeping them from playing a broader role in the international community that might be adverse to their interests, and to dampening democracy's appeal. So to be, able to say to would-be activists at home, like, it doesn't look so good, right? And so I think what we need to do is, take an honest stock of what are our strengths and our vulnerabilities, and to shore up our vulnerabilities where possible, and then to go on offense in the spaces that are most conducive to our success. So, like, Russia chooses the asymmetric tool of information manipulation because it views that as a battle space, to use a metaphor, that is advantages them. And I would argue, like, democracies cannot win a battle of information operations, right? Our system depends on the notion that there is objective truth, that citizens can discern it, can use it, to make decisions of self-government. And so we will, like, only harm ourselves if we do what, for example, the French government was revealed as having done in Africa, and engage in this kind of manipulative behavior ourselves. Instead, we have other advantages. We have cyber capabilities. We have, rule of law. We have a robust network of partners. We have these other advantages. And so I think we need to be thoughtful about how to, pursue the competition on our own terms. And I would argue that authoritarians are vulnerable in an information competition, right? Like, the reason that they suppress, surveil, repress, censor, is because open information, an open information environment, while it is a short-term vulnerability for us that, Russia and China have proven adept at exploiting, in the long term, they face structural vulnerabilities or weaknesses. And so I think, like, a robust anti-corruption campaign that exposes the failures and false promises of, these types of regimes is a way of competing, in the information space that is conducive to our own strengths.
I actually would argue with Jessica a little bit that I don't fully agree with this assessment, because Russia and China in contemporary world, at least from the Russian perspective, are not necessarily selling the old version of democracy. They don't have anything to offer, honestly, as compared to, for example, the competition during the Cold War. What they're doing is they're selling the narratives that undermine the legitimacy of democracies in the West. They're not necessarily offering the alternative, be like Russia. But they are successful enough in the sense that in intensifying this already multiplying doubt about the viability of liberal democracies in the West. This is where I see the main danger lies. But at the same time, honestly, the findings of our report and what Nick said as well, I find quite encouraging. If anything, I find them very optimistic, because Nick essentially has said that what used to be a real threat back in 2016, in 2020 has been replaced by a fear of what used to be a real threat, right? And this fear is now has become so deep that it has been essentially politicized as a tool of its own against the political opponents. So in this sense, and we also find that this is good news in the sense that the real threat has been a little bit mitigated. It is still there, but the impact is not as pronounced and is not as all embracing as what we saw in 2016. That means that the US democracy is able to come up with a viable response. That is a good news. But I wanted to draw your attention to the domestic problems in the US. So the key takeaway of our report, at least the way I see that, and me and Kahei, we continue this analysis right now. For the academic purposes, we find consistently that the groups that engaged with disinformation on both right and left, they share very, very similar characteristics. This is the key finding. They're not that different, those radicals on the left and the radicals on the right. And those characteristics are primarily the low trust in institutions in the United States, the low trust in the media. This, I think, should be one of the key policy takeaways. I mean, not particular groundbreaking, of course, but the lack of the media platform, somewhere where these groups could see each other. This, as we at least see, one of the key problems, because in this dynamic where both sides of the political spectrum keep attacking each other and never really meet each other, and will probably be even less likely to meet each other now that Twitter has banned many of the radical right accounts, and they're all kind of self-selected on other social media. This we see certainly as a problem, because essentially, how are they to construct this more productive narrative? How do they cooperate essentially when they don't really have a neutral platform that's possible for both of the sides to trust? This is one of the key problems. But ultimately, in my other analysis on Europe, since Jakob Marabir, I just quickly mentioned that I also study groups that are pro-Russian in European democracies. And I find that actually all of them tend to share Euroscepticism more than love for Russia or Putin's ideal system. And that actually is a good news in the sense that it shows that collusion of the interests between these groups and Putin's Russia are quite temporary and opportunistic. There is no real strong affinity to Putin's system. There is just a temporary alignment of interests, which hopefully will go away soon enough.
Thank you very much. Nick, did you want to add anything to this part, or should I already go to the Q&A session? No, you're fine.
Yeah.
We actually have quite a few questions already for the past 20 minutes. So let me read 3 at once, and you can feel free to pick whichever one you like. And Nick, perhaps you should start, since you were silent in the last round of Qs. So we have a question from Dionisio Urteaga Todo. How to build an international strong legal framework to counter this kind of actions? Do Western countries have tools appropriated to counter the actions performed by Russia? And then I have 2 questions from Dylan McQuaid. What role did the Russians have in the QAnon conspiracy theories and the theories that the 2020 elections were stolen? And the second question is, what policies can the US Congress put in place to help stop the spread of this misinformation? Nick, feel free to pick whichever questions you might like.
Sure, I can start with the QAnon and 2020 elections. And see, there's a question further down that also touches on this from Tom Warwick on why didn't Russia do more to screw with the election. In particular, the January 6th attack demonstrates how frighteningly effective social media activity can be to fomenting this sort of unrest. And I think the main point I would make there is what we've already kind of highlighted so far, in that Russian interference and campaigns related to US can primarily be characterized as co-opting existing narratives. I don't think anyone can reasonably make the claim that Russia would have been able to have the same impact that domestic actors did in something like the Stop the Steal narrative heading up to January 6th. They just don't have the credibility, the groundswell, the even just linguistic capabilities to some degree to have the same impact that domestic actors do on those same topics, on the same narratives. And this is actually distinct from what we've seen in international Russian operations, for example, the downing of MH17 in 2014, or the poisoning of in Salisbury in 2018. Russia took a different approach. Those were very much proactive narratives that they were pushing, as opposed to the 2016 co-opting of existing narratives. And I think that's the same thing we've seen with QAnon. There's evidence of overlap of known Russian assets of Russian campaigns with QAnon narratives, but it spread originally, and really the contribution to its main growth were domestic actors that Russia was kind of hopping on to then further exacerbate and deepen the divides of. So all the points have already been made on the need to address that as a fundamental issue are kind of part and parcel with the question of where can Russia have success when targeting the same narratives, whether QAnon or January 6th. I think that's the main point to make there. On policy, we could have another 4-hour conversation on just that. There's a lot of debates now with the new administration on Section 230 reform, on something like a data privacy law coming out of California that's similar to GDPR. The EU just put forward a bunch of legislation on that front. In the interest of time, maybe I'll defer to other panelists if they have top line thoughts on that set of issues.
Thank you. Jessica, is there anything you would like to answer from the questions in the first round?
Sure. Well, maybe I would just point to a takeaway from 2020 for me, which was, this is fundamentally a structural problem, right? When we saw, I can't remember, but it was like 1,000 people every 10 seconds joining Stop the Steal groups in the days after the election. That behavior is driven by, it's a choice, and it's driven by an algorithm that feeds folks like the suggestion. And we saw Facebook had to break glass, right? Had to take measures to just fundamentally change the way that its platform is designed to operate to avert catastrophe. And I think that is telling. And so, as we consider what kinds of regulatory approaches and policy shifts are necessary, I think we just need to bear in mind that content moderation is important, but it's not going to be the only solution here. Like we have to be more thoughtful about the architecture, the way information moves across the ecosystem. I think one of the more successful interventions was Twitter, sort of introducing friction, requiring, prompting you, did you read that article? Did you click the link before you share it, or requiring you to quote tweet and add your own thoughts, right? Slowing down the spread of information and encouraging people to behave more thoughtfully. These are the kinds of interventions that I think are promising.
Thank you, Jessica. Marek, I believe you wanted to ask one of the questions as well.
Well, I think Jessica makes a great point earlier about offensive versus defensive capabilities, right? And so the United States has significant offensive capabilities in terms of cyber command to deal with these kinds of situations. But ideally, we want to be able to kind of have a more defensive approach so we don't have to kind of go down that route. And I think one thing I just want to, and maybe this is just the sociologist in me, but this broader issue of Iran, we call it truth decay, this decline of facts and the decay of like a public discourse, which again creates this opportunity. And I think that there's a lot of things we can look at broadly, civics, education, and whatnot that can deal with this. But I also think we have to kind of keep in mind that, what we call pluralistic ignorance. It's this idea that we're really bad at determining the distribution of public opinion around us. So the few who talk a lot, let it be a Russian troll or a kook on the left or the far right, can really have an outsized effect on how we view the world. And I think the social media companies, I would argue, they have a role to make sure that who is online, who's on their platforms, is who they claim they are. And I think one thing that if you look at filings for Facebook, Twitter, and whatnot, they have to list in their SEC filings their monthly active users. And I do think that there should be some type of auditable standard of who a user is on Facebook and Twitter and these other types of platforms. And that's a pretty simple policy change, is just to make sure that there's some kind of consistent reporting mechanism, and that would protect investors. It would also protect, I think, a large swath of the population, because then they would actually have a way to assess who is someone on these platforms. And so I think there's a lot of things. We don't have to have overarching sweeping changes to our society, but I do think there are things that we can do that are relatively small that could have a really large impact, and that we should be considering these going forward.
Just very, very quickly, a change like that, removing anonymity on the internet will also have implications for human rights activists and others in closed spaces. So as we think about the kinds of interventions that, make sense in a US context, we also need to be thoughtful about how they will impact the rights and freedoms of billions of people around the world.
And to actually add on that, I would really hate to lose Darth Putin KGB account on Twitter. That's one of the most important I follow, really. Let me move to other questions. We have a cue from Thomas Warwick. So why didn't Russia do more to really screw up the US politics in the 2020 elections? The events that led up to and after the January 6th mob attack on the Capitol should demonstrate how frighteningly effective such an operation could have been. Let me take a few more questions just to speed it up a bit. How to coordinate the actions to counter Russian activity? Well, that's again a little bit of the policy question, which we already said that that might be a bit different topic. Let's move to a question from Daniel Kenyon. What is the role of Russian diaspora in host country election manipulation, including the US? And how can the Kremlin-directed Russian diaspora political activity be differentiated from legitimate, independent Russian diaspora political activity? Maria, that sounds to me like a question really for you.
Thank you, Jakob. Yeah, I wanted to ask first to Thomas's to answer first to Thomas's question, and I'm sure there will be other participants of our panel who would probably correct me. But the Alma report answers that the Kremlin really couldn't do much more than it already did for two reasons. First of all, a polarized political environment in the United States is doing a lot of work for the Kremlin, right, as we have discussed. And the storm of the Capitol is one of the worst possible manifestations of what could have happened. Definitely function more of the polarization that is inherently domestic in nature. Second, that of course also the report's takeaways is that the counter effort in the United States has successfully blocked a lot of the accounts that in the past were considered to be quite influential, and it takes time and effort to build popular accounts with mass followers that subsequently become influential because of the successful counter effort. Now the Kremlin proxies have a harder time doing it. But on the diaspora question, that's a great one for me. Certainly, I can be probably considered a member of the Russian diaspora here. But to be honest, I'm not quite aware, although I'll be also honestly say that I have not really investigated this issue in a lot of detail. I do not know of instances where specifically confirmed coordination between significant numbers of Russian diaspora here and the Kremlin have been confirmed. The Russian diaspora members often are actually quite pro-Trumpist in the first place, so there perhaps not much, not much additional push was needed from the Kremlin. Second of all, they are often quite anti-Kremlin and anti-Putin. It's an interesting combination of preferences that they have. So therefore, I think it's actually harder to make them like maybe openly abrasive of the narratives that the Kremlin promotes. So that's unfortunately all I can add on this one.
If I could follow on briefly on the second question on the diaspora, I think it raises an interesting point in terms of some of the definitions and technicalities of research as it comes to attribution, and in particular a distinction between content and behavior. It's one of the most important things we as researchers have to focus on when identifying a disinformation campaign. And when we traditionally talk about disinformation, at least in kind of a colloquial sense, you are usually equating that with false information. But a lot of times disinformation on platform is false behavior, not false content. If you take the IRA in 2016, for example, the narratives they were spreading were existing domestic political conversations in the US, whether, anti-abortion, pro-abortion, guns against gun, none of those were new narratives. None of them were, depending on your political view, false narratives. What was false was that they were claiming to be Americans that were saying those things, that were saying the more extreme side of those opinions, and were in fact Russian citizens being paid by the Russian government sitting in St. Petersburg. And so that distinction between the inauthenticity of behavior and content comes to this question of how do you make attribution claims, how do you remove them? Because in a lot of the cases, it's not actually down to the content itself. It's tracking it to the specificity of the companies, for example, if you're going to use IP addresses. So coming down to how do we distinguish between the actors involved, it really is not clearly delineated, but very particular set of parameters that have to be met when you're talking about full-scale removal of what Facebook, for example, denotes as coordinated inauthentic behavior, CIB, and that's a lot different than taking issue with something because it's a spinning of a narrative or potentially false in its distribution. But when you're talking about these large-scale removals, it's primarily the inauthenticity of behavior as opposed to content, and that's at the root of a lot of the removals. Same thing with peace data in 2020.
Let me actually stop here and just to clarify. From an outside point of view, it almost seems that this attitude is slowly changing. That the platforms are not taking down content based on only the inauthentic behavior, but actually also based on the content itself. If we have a look at taking down of Donald Trump's accounts recently because of inciting violence, it actually goes nicely with the very recent decision of Latvia to ban some of the Russian TV channels precisely because of inciting violence, inciting hatred. They are violating local laws. That's why Latvia is banning them. So do you think this is slowly shifting, that the platforms are kind of moving away from just targeting the inauthentic behavior?
I mean, I would argue we have a long tradition of thinking about how to deal with problematic speech, and it's not to silence it. There are certain problems that are content problems, and hate speech is one of them. Incitement to violence is one of them. Child pornography is one of them, right? And these are problems that are, I think, appropriately dealt with as content problems. But I take Nick's point, I very seriously and want to foot stomp it that, disinformation is not about false content. It's about content that's polarizing or misleading, and it is not properly understood as a content problem.
I will say that, Jakob, to your question, that I think that trend is correct, at least within the more modern conception of content moderation on platforms. And I think that's primarily because behavior, since attribution is so hard, behavior is one of the easier lines to enforce by, because it's more definable to some degree, whereas content is just, it opens up so many avenues. Jessica mentioned on with freedom of expression, First Amendment. You see the Facebook Oversight Board now is created basically entirely to debate and discuss those questions. That being said, now that the impact of content on platform is just so much more widely known, with things like anything from the Christchurch shooting to January 6th to QAnon, I think we are seeing a more of an aggressive stance towards defining things based on the category of content, such as large-scale removal of all QAnon-based groups on Facebook, for example.
It almost sounds a bit scary to me that we are still discussing these questions in 2021, when the renewed Russian information aggression has been going on at least since the revolution in Ukraine. So one would have almost thought that we had quite a few years to deal with these problems, but we still have to discuss them as open questions. Let me just move to the questions sent by our viewers. We have one from anonymous attendee. Facebook's business model reportedly profits off of and pushes disinformation on their platform, which is a main cause in how quickly these disinformation campaigns spread. Are other platforms using similar business models, and how concerned are you about other platforms' business models? We have a question from Alex Simonelis. Trump, as opposed to previous presidents, authorized offensive cyber operations. Is Biden continuing Trump's policy or reversing it? And let me take one more here from Silamperto. I'm sorry if I'm reading it wrongly. It looks a bit like Finnish or Estonian name. Why or how would the alignment of interests between the Kremlin and Western radical right parties go away anytime soon? Anyone wants to pick any of these questions in particular?
I can take a stab at two of them. In terms of radical right versus radical left, I just want to reiterate, I suspect that the United States is undergoing a political realignment, where basically political parties are patchworks of interest groups glued together underneath a common banner. They swap out every few decades. We're probably undergoing that right now. And so what you're seeing is an opportunity where you can kind of exploit that. And so there might be more opportunities on the more conservative side of the spectrum, but make no mistake about it, this has been done on the liberal side of the spectrum too. And I mean, the perfect example of this is historically the KGB efforts to try to co-opt the civil rights movement, which really weren't that successful. In terms of the social media companies' business models, Jessica makes a great point. The social media companies, they provide opportunities for people in various parts of the world to, express themselves where they may otherwise not be able to. But on the flip side of it, we'll take Facebook, for example. 95+% of their revenue is advertising. In essence, Facebook's a digital billboard. And so, people are investing in that company because advertisers are paying them money so they can advertise to real people. People are investing in that company because they're assuming that, this business model is legitimate. And there are serious questions about, how accurate is that? And I do think it's not a black or white issue, but I do think that the social media companies have done a lot to make sure that, there's not as much transparency underneath the hood. And I think in some cases, Facebook's advertising model has actually overstated the number of reach of their platforms to the point where they've overstated the number of people that they can reach in the United States, surpassing what the Census Bureau says are the total number of Americans. And those are areas of concern because there's a lot of fake accounts where they actually might be legitimate activists, but that does raise questions about these click farms. It raises questions about, Russian trolls who are trying to exploit this. And I think there's a balance where we don't go to one extreme, but we also don't go to the other. And I just want to note one last thing is that Russia's not the only player in this game. When my reports for RAND came out, I was contacted by a researcher from one of the Ayatollah's think tanks wanting to have a Zoom call, which obviously was not going to happen because we implicate Iran in our report. But I think that does signal that a lot of other countries are seeing this as a very cheap tool that they can use. And I think there's an opportunity to find a balance between the free speech, but also making sure that we have proper controls. So we're not just giving opportunities to adversaries to misuse that free speech.
I can add a very brief comment on the question on the new administration's posture. Obviously, it's very early on, but Biden recently gave a speech at the State Department laying out his foreign policy priorities. And one thing he explicitly mentioned was a deputy national security advisor being added to focus specifically on cyber and emerging technology. And there's also going to be the implementation of basically a cyber director that's mandated by the NDAA. And so those are all initial kind of steps towards a continuation of a more aggressive posture on these issues, which is encouraging, at least from early days.
Jessica, did you want to add something to this?
Sure, I would just say, President Trump did, use offensive cyber, for example, to take the IRA offline for a few days around 2018 and, pursue this hunt forward, persistent engagement approach ahead of 2020. But he was not the only president who's used offensive cyber, quite spectacularly, both Presidents Bush and Obama in efforts targeted on Iran and North Korea's nuclear weapons capabilities have used, offensive cyber. So I suspect that this is a tool, a weapon of war that will continue to be a part of the president's arsenal.
And for the last 2 minutes, Maria found herself a question that she wants to answer, and it is definitely a very interesting one. Let me read it out for all the attendants. Russia tests all methods of harmful effects on information and goes within the country on its citizens, and only after that they go to the rest of the world. Do you think it would be correct to analyze more what is happening inside the informational space of Russia and thus prepare in advance for what can be applied by Russia in the rest of the world? And I would add, I think the same goes for Ukraine. Ukraine also seems to me to be the testing ground of Russian information operations. But Maria, please go ahead.
Thanks a lot, Jakob. And very quickly on another question that certainly followed up what I said before about temporary alignment between the interests of the Kremlin and Western radical right. Sorry for self-citation, but it's all my dissertation is about how ultimately support for far-right groups is driven by legitimate grievances, economic, social status issues that many of their supporters have. So addressing those grievances, trying to reach out reaching out to those groups and reincorporate them to the mainstream political process is, I think, is a way to go. Unfortunately, easier said than done. And of course, the excellent question, I thank the participant for asking it, about how the one that Jakob read. Certainly, we see that repeatedly, that domestic Russia, as well as Eastern Europe or Central Eastern Europe altogether, all serve to be the testing grounds of Russia's disinformation efforts and tools that are supplied in Western Europe. And in Russia, since I follow Russia's domestic situation and study as well, we see all the same tools used by the Kremlin in order to destruct the narratives, polarize the society, polarize their position, divide their position, etc., shift the narrative, etc., etc. All of those methods are tried there for two reasons. Primarily, of course, it's much more important for the Kremlin what happens domestically for the longer term survival of Kremlin's elites in power. And of course, it's easier since the Kremlin has more or less much stronger control over domestic social media environment. Therefore, of course, one of the future developments of this research is trying to understand what and how the Kremlin proxies do in Russia domestically, and then subsequently trying to figure out how they modify these approaches when applying. So there is a lot for us to study.
I think this is a brilliant bridge to our next event. Today we are unfortunately already out of time, so if I could just thank Maria not only for answering the last question, but also for writing the whole report and joining us for the discussion. Let me thank to Jessica Brandt from German Marshall Fund. Let me thank to Mark Posart from RAND Corporation, and our own Nick Yap from the Digital Forensic Research Lab, and also the whole team that has been organizing this event. Thank you very much, and I hope we will see you next time during one of these events. Have a nice day.